Since March 5, 1945, the sun hadn't fully risen over the gray waters of the Pacific when Lieutenant James Harrow lit his last cigarette before briefing. His hands, calloused and cut from months at sea, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the idea he had carried for weeks. A 50-foot boat, a suicide run, 8 Japanese warships anchored too close for comfort at the mouth of Manila Bay, and no one willing to listen to a man desperate enough to try the unthinkable. The officers had laughed at first. "It's not bravery, it's madness," one of the Navy brass had said, brushing off Harrow's sketchy blueprint of a modified torpedo boat rigged with experimental explosives and fuel boosters. Harrow didn't argue. It was madness, but so was letting those warships sit there, raining death on anything trying to reclaim the Philippines. He had seen what those ships had done to his comrades: the hospital tent burning on the beach, the twisted wreckage of a downed transport plane, the charred bodies they never even had time to bury properly. He'd watched it all from the trees, helpless and furious, chewing sand and rage until the idea came to him like lightning in a bottle. What if a single small boat, fast enough, could get in close enough before they even had time to react? The Navy denied him 5 times. 5 times he walked into the tent with plans, maps, numbers. 5 times he was dismissed. Until the 6th meeting, when Rear Admiral Collins, short-tempered and drunk on defeat, finally slammed his fist on the table and said, "Fine, die if you want to. Just don't take a whole crew with you." That was all Harrow needed. In the next 3 days, Harrow and 3 mechanics rebuilt a 50-foot PT boat from the graveyard at Subic Bay. It wasn't much. The hull was cracked, the engine wheezed like a smoker on his deathbed, and the armaments were stripped. But Harrow didn't need guns. He needed speed and fire. He added twin aviation fuel tanks along the sides, each one rigged to detonate on impact. They pulled the torpedoes from a wrecked sub and reattached them at a brutal angle that made aiming nearly impossible, but perfect for a close-range sprint. They layered the hull with leftover steel plates, more for his own peace of mind than actual protection. Then he painted it matte black. No name, no flag, just shadows and silence. Only one man volunteered to go with him: Boatswain Eric Mendez, a wiry, half-crazy Puerto Rican sailor who had lost 3 brothers in the Pacific campaign and didn't much care about living past 30. "If we're going to hell," Mendez grinned as he adjusted the straps on his life vest, "might as well light the match ourselves." That night, they pushed the boat into the dark water. No one saluted. No one cheered. Most thought they'd be blown out of the water before they even reached halfway. But Harrow believed in the one thing those warships didn't account for: desperation with a purpose. They hit full throttle by 0200 hours. The boat groaned under the weight of fuel and bombs, skipping across the surface like a stone on fire. The radar was turned off. The radio was silent. This wasn't a mission. It was a dare between death and timing. And then the lights appeared. 8 Japanese warships, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight, sitting in a perfect crescent formation, arrogant, untouchable. Until now. By 02:13 hours, the Japanese fleet was in full view, their searchlights lazily sweeping the open water. They weren't expecting anything. Why would they? The Americans were still regrouping miles away, licking their wounds after the last assault. And no sane man would pilot a 50-foot coffin straight into the jaws of hell. But James Harrow was already beyond sanity. The engine screamed beneath his boots. The deck rattled with every surge. His fingers locked onto the throttle like it was the only thing keeping his heart from bursting. Beside him, Mendez stood motionless, hands on the trigger of the torpedo release system, his lips whispering something that might have been a prayer or a curse. Maybe both. The plan was suicidal. No zigzags. No evasive maneuvers. just a straight, flaming arrow through the heart of the Imperial fleet. The Japanese destroyers were spaced just enough apart to fit through. If they could hit the lead cruiser, the Yamashiko Maru, the largest of the group, then the chain reaction might take out the rest. Harrow had calculated the blast radius, guessed the fuel load of the ships, and prayed their formation would hold. At 02:17, the first searchlight caught them. "Starboard!" Mendez shouted, but Harrow didn't flinch. Bullets ripped through the night like angry wasps. One clipped the radio mast clean off. Another punched through the side of the hull, spraying sea mist and fire in the same breath. "Keep straight," Harrow barked. "We veer! We die before we reach them!" Tracer fire lit the sky now. Blinding streaks of orange and red like the heavens themselves were bleeding. Alarms rang out from the nearest ship. The Japanese scrambled, thinking maybe it was an American squadron or a surprise attack. But no, just one boat. One black phantom speeding toward them with death stitched into its bones. The cruiser loomed ahead like a wall of steel and arrogance. Harrow's eyes burned from salt and smoke. Mendez shouted over the chaos, "5 seconds! Fire 1!" The first torpedo launched with a mechanical clank, slicing through the water with a hiss. Then the second! Fire 2! They hit the first warship mid-hull just as it began to turn. The explosion was instant, blinding, deafening, a flash that turned the night into day. The fuel tank ignited with a roar, sending fire and metal hundreds of feet into the air. The ship buckled, a giant groaning in its death throes. But Harrow didn't stop. He veered hard left toward the next target, a smaller destroyer that had just begun to fire its side guns. Shells slammed into the water around them, one tearing a hole through the front deck. Mendez was bleeding now, from the shoulder, maybe the leg, but still on his feet. "Light it," Harrow said, flipping the ignition on the fuel tank detonators. "You sure?" Mendez asked, wide-eyed. "We're already dead. Let's just make it count." As they neared the destroyer, Harrow cranked the engine beyond redline. The gauges shattered. The hull groaned like it was about to crack in half. Then they slammed the side of the Japanese ship at full speed. For a split second, just one, everything stopped. Then, the explosion. It wasn't just fire. It was wrath. The aviation fuel ignited with such fury that it tore the side off the destroyer and splashed flaming metal across 2 more ships beside it. The blast ripped through the deck like a shockwave, triggering munitions, setting off chain reactions. Ammo stores lit up. Engines exploded. A second ship buckled, capsized. A third caught firebow to stern. From the cliffs miles away, American scouts watching through binoculars could hardly believe what they saw. Flames erupted across the enemy fleet. Giant ships, invincible hours ago, were now screaming infernos on the sea. "Dear God," one whispered. "He's doing it." In 15 minutes, 8 warships had either sunk or were burning beyond salvation, and no one had seen James Harrow or Eric Mendez after that. Just the fire, and the silence that followed. By sunrise, the sea looked like it had been carved open by God himself. The thick black smoke hung low, curling over the burning wrecks like mourning veils. Pieces of steel floated by, twisted, scorched, and unrecognizable. Bodies, too. Some Japanese sailors clung to debris, screaming orders, prayers, or nothing at all. Others didn't scream anymore. Their war ended in that 15-minute fury. Back at the American outpost near Cavite, radios buzzed with disbelief. 8 confirmed hits. Repeat, 8 ships down. Possible single-unit assault. Source unknown. Colonel Briggs stared at the static-filled transmission, rubbing his temples. What in the holy hell just happened out there? They sent a reconnaissance plane by mid-morning. The pilot, Lieutenant Rowe, circled once, twice, before finally spotting what was left. A half-submerged black hull, split down the middle, floating in a pool of fire and diesel. No life rafts. No movement. Just the eerie, triumphant silence of a suicide run fulfilled. Small boat. PT class. Rowe radioed. Looks like it hit the second destroyer point blank. No survivors visible. Whole sectors burning. Are you sure it's not airstrike damage? Someone asked. Rowe paused. No aircraft in the area. No shell craters. This was up close. This was personal. Back at base, the brass began piecing it together. The missing fuel. The torpedoes requisitioned without approval. The modified PT boat spotted 2 days ago near the old scrapyard. And finally, the name whispered by the Filipino dock boys, who helped haul the engine into the water that night. Lieutenant James Harrow. By noon, he was a legend. But legends are messy things. Rear Admiral Collins, the same man who had begrudgingly signed off on Harrow's suicide mission, was now pacing in front of a press team, sweat staining his collar. There was no official operation involving a single vessel strike. Any such actions were rogue and unapproved. This command does not endorse unauthorized combat operations. He was already drafting the court-martial papers in his head. If Harrow had survived, they'd pin him with insubordination, reckless conduct, maybe even theft of military property. Heroism didn't always come wrapped in medals. Sometimes it came with handcuffs. But Harrow wasn't there to answer, or so they thought. That evening, a small Filipino fishing boat docked quietly at the southern edge of the bay. 2 figures slumped inside, barely conscious, burned, bleeding. One was whispering a name over and over through cracked lips. Mendez. The other wasn't speaking at all, just holding his ribs with one hand and a tattered photo of a woman with the other. James Harrow had survived. Somehow, maybe by luck, maybe by sheer hatred of dying. He and Mendez had been thrown clear by the secondary blast. They landed miles apart, floating in the wreckage until local fishermen pulled them from the water, thinking they were ghosts. They were rushed to a medic tent, where nurses gasped at their wounds. Harrow's body was riddled with shrapnel. His right leg was nearly shattered. Mendez had burns up both arms and a punctured lung. Neither man could stand, but both were alive. The hospital staff didn't ask questions. They just patched them up and stared at the horizon, where smoke still rose like black flags, waving goodbye to an enemy that never saw it coming. Word spread fast. The newspapers wanted his face on the front page. Soldiers lined up outside the medic tent just to shake his hand. Generals who had ignored him now called him a visionary. They offered medals, promotions, a book deal, even a damn movie. But Harrow didn't smile. He stared out the hospital tent flap at the ocean and said only one thing to the nurse who brought him soup. They told me no, and now look at the sea. The morning after Harrow regained consciousness, a pair of stern-faced MPs stood at the entrance of the medic tent. Their uniforms were crisp, untouched by war. Their orders were clear: escort Lieutenant James Harrow to the command center immediately. Still bandaged, limping, and stitched from shoulder to thigh, Harrow hobbled through the base with one crutch and no salute. Soldiers paused and stared as he passed, some whispering, others nodding with silent respect. He didn't acknowledge any of them, not out of arrogance but exhaustion. His soul was burnt, just like the hull of that ghost ship he'd piloted into hell. At the command tent, Rear Admiral Collins didn't look up when Harrow entered. He just flipped through a folder. His folder. Service record, infractions, commendations. At the bottom, a letter of recommendation. Never sent. You disobeyed direct orders, Collins said, finally glancing up. I know. You stole military equipment. Modified government property. You violated protocol, engaged without backup, and risked the entire campaign. Silence. Then Harrow said, and I sank 8 ships. Collins's jaw tightened. At what cost? Less than the next month of bombings would have cost us. Less than the lives of the men buried yesterday. Less than the integrity of command that sat on its ass while that fleet murdered its way across the bay. The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, Harrow thought he was going to be arrested right there. But instead, Collins leaned back and sighed. "You're a goddamn headache, Lieutenant. But the President's on the line. He wants to speak to the American devil who turned 8 Imperial ships into scrap metal in 15 minutes. Harrow blinked. "The President? You want to ignore that call too?" The phone was handed to him. Static crackled. Then came the voice. "Lieutenant Harrow, this is Harry S. Truman. I've heard about your little joyride." Harrow straightened instinctively. "Sir, I've also read reports. 8 Japanese warships confirmed destroyed. No support. No retreat. That true?" "Yes, sir. But I didn't do it alone." "I know. Boatswain Eric Mendez is being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross." Harrow's voice cracked slightly. "He nearly died, sir. You both nearly did. But your actions changed the tide. Intel shows Japanese forces have begun retreating from Luzon. They thought we were scared. They thought they had us cornered." A pause. "They don't think that anymore." Click. The line went dead. Harrow stood in silence. For the first time since the mission, a deep pit of emotion opened inside him. Not pride, not relief, just the weight of survival. When he returned to the medical tent, Mendez was awake, barely. His eyes fluttered open and he grinned weakly. "Bro, I heard we're famous," Harrow chuckled. "More like infamous." They sat in silence for a while, both staring at the ceiling, both too tired to talk. Then Mendez, voice raspy, said, "Think they'll ever tell the truth? About what we did?" Harrow thought about that, about how the Navy would spin it, how they'd clean it up for the papers, polish it for the public, erase the defiance, and paint it as bravery approved by brass. "No," he said. "They'll rewrite the whole thing. Make it prettier," Mendez grinned. "Then let's make sure someone writes it dirty." By the end of the week, a war correspondent snuck into the tent. Young, curious, and eager for something rawer than the official report. Harrow told him everything. Every rule broken. Every risk taken. Every flame and scream and split-second decision that left the sea boiling in its own shame. The article never ran in the official military press, but it spread through the trenches like wildfire. The suicide run that made the empire bleed. And from then on, even in whispered disbelief, every soldier from the Philippines to Okinawa knew the name Harrow. Not as a hero, as a man who didn't wait for permission to end a war. 2 weeks later, the official medal ceremony felt more like a cover-up than an honor. James Harrow stood stiff in his borrowed uniform, cleaned up, stitched together, but still limping like a man who left half his body in the ocean. Beside him, Eric Mendez leaned heavily on a cane, his arms wrapped in gauze and medals he never asked for. The generals lined up like statues, chests puffed, faces carved in polished stone. Journalists snapped photos. Brass bands played. A press officer read from a script that felt so sanitized it made Harrow want to puke. For their extraordinary valor and unwavering commitment to mission success in the face of insurmountable odds. Insurmountable odds? No mention of how they'd begged for permission and been laughed out of the tent. No mention of how Harrow stole the parts. No mention of the fuel tanks rigged to explode or the screams of Japanese sailors drowning in their own wreckage. Just glitter and flag-waving and fake smiles. When it was over, Mendez muttered under his breath, "They gave me a ribbon for almost dying and never asked why we had to go rogue." Harrow didn't answer. He was too busy watching the men who once called him a lunatic, now clapping as if they'd been behind him all along. Later that night, a car pulled up outside the hospital barracks where Harrow and Mendez were recovering. A young lieutenant in full dress stepped out, holding a leather case. This just came in from the War Department. For Lieutenant Harrow. Inside was a sealed letter. Confidential. Marked Eyes Only. Harrow opened it, slowly. It wasn't a thank you. It was an offer. We have reviewed your tactical improvisation and acknowledge its unprecedented success. You possess a rare willingness to operate outside conventional warfare. The Office of Strategic Operations is forming a new experimental unit. Off the books. No rules, no red tape, complete autonomy. If you're interested, we could use men like you. At the bottom, a name. Major William Donovan. He had heard of Donovan, the so-called father of American intelligence. Rumors whispered his name in every mess hall and bar tent from Europe to the Pacific. Ghost operations, deep cover missions, sabotage that never made it into the history books. They weren't offering Harrow a medal. They were offering him a war behind the war. He handed the letter to Mendez, who read it twice. So, Mendez finally said, they tried to court-martial you, then decorate you. Now they want to recruit you? Harrow lit a cigarette. They don't want another suicide run. They want me to teach them how to build more. The next morning, Harrow signed the letter and left his Navy tags on the hospital bed. No fanfare, no goodbye, just a silent nod to Mendez, who stayed behind with a busted lung, a medal he didn't care for, and one hell of a story to tell anyone drunk enough to believe it. 2 weeks later, whispers began, of an American operative who destroyed a Japanese ammo depot using only a fishing boat and a crate of stolen grenades, of a mission in Burma, where a lone figure redirected an entire enemy convoy into a minefield, using rigged lights and fake radio signals, no names, no records, but always the same whisper at the end of the story. It's the Devil of Manila, Bay. He's still out there. The jungles. A French Indochina didn't care about medals or myths. They swallowed men whole, one by one, leaving nothing but bones and whispers behind. But James Harrow moved through them like smoke, unseen and untouchable. 3 months after the Manila Bay incident, he wasn't just another soldier anymore. He was a ghost with a purpose. Armed, trained, and angry in all the right ways. His missions had no names, no briefings, just coordinates slipped under his door or scrawled on napkins and handed off by drunks in Saigon bars. He worked in silence, spoke only when needed, and always finished what he started. His newest assignment? A Japanese field commander known as General Yato, a war butcher. The man was running a prison camp deep in the jungle where American POWs were disappearing without record, executed, experimented on, or simply erased. The official orders from the OSS were clear. Infiltrate. Confirm Yato's presence. Mark coordinates for an airstrike. But Harrow had no intention of marking anything for someone else to blow up. This wasn't about strategy. This was personal. On his 3rd night in country, he slit the throats of 2 perimeter guards and stole their uniforms. By the 4th night, he had found the camp. Fenced in with bamboo, patrolled by boy-faced Japanese soldiers who smoked too much and watched too little. The prisoners inside looked like walking skeletons, eyes sunken, skin stretched, some too broken to speak. One of them, an American pilot, was missing both ears. When Harrow slipped a piece of chocolate into the man's palm and asked him what happened here, the pilot only said one word before crying, Yato. That night, Harrow didn't sleep. He lay under the jungle canopy, rain dripping off the leaves, his hands steady as he loaded a modified M1 carbine with a silencer made from a hacked-off pipe. He carried only that, a knife, 2 grenades, and the anger of every man who ever screamed and was ignored. By sunrise, half the camp was dead. He moved like a shadow, throat after throat, bullet after bullet. When the alarms finally screamed, Harrow kicked open the door of the command hut and found Yato still pulling on his boots, shocked to see a white devil covered in blood. The general reached for his pistol. Harrow shot his hand off. "I'm not here to kill you quick," Harrow said, stepping forward, kicking the screaming man back into the mud. "I want every prisoner here to see you bleed." And he made sure they did. It wasn't execution. It was justice served in a language only fire and screams could translate. By noon, Harrow had rigged the whole camp with dynamite, freed all 57 POWs, and lit the fuse as they hobbled away into the jungle. From miles out, they heard the explosion. A fireball rose into the canopy. No survivors. When the OSS finally caught wind of what happened, the report was filed under deniable action. No official statement, no credit, no press release, but the surviving prisoners spoke anyway. "An angel of death," one called him. "A devil who looked like a man," another whispered. "He said one thing when he cut Yato's throat," the pilot with no ears recounted. "Said, 'This is for the bay.' I didn't know what he meant. But he meant it hard." Back at OSS headquarters, Major Donovan poured himself a drink after reading the classified dispatch. He tapped his pen on Harrow's file. "This man," he muttered to his aide, "isn't fighting the war." "He is the war," the aide looked uneasy. "Sir, if he keeps going like this, he won't survive the next one." Donovan smirked. "He's not trying to survive." By early 1946, the war was technically over. The surrender was signed, the flags lowered, and the world breathed out a sigh of relief. Streets back home filled with parades, newspapers declared victory, and soldiers finally got to go home to families who barely recognized them. But James Harrow didn't go home, because his war hadn't ended. It had just gone underground. While the world cheered, the Office of Strategic Services quietly restructured into something colder, deeper. A ghost agency for a world that was no longer black and white. The CIA hadn't been born yet, but the shadows were already moving. And inside those shadows, Harrow found himself being passed from one unmarked plane to the next, slipping through borders like a rumor. One day, Burma. Next week, Soviet-controlled Poland. Then Berlin, where the ruins still smoldered, and the real war, the one of secrets and knives, was just getting started. In Berlin, his orders were unclear. Find a man, watch him, eliminate if necessary. The name was Dr. Klaus Reiniger, a former Nazi biochemist who'd been captured by American forces, but somehow kept slipping away into civilian labs. Rumor was the U.S. wanted to use his research before the Russians did. Harrow didn't care about the politics, only about the list of names he found tied to Reiniger's work. Prisoners, children, experiments done in silence under the flags of two fallen empires. So, when Harrow found Reiniger sipping wine at a French cafe in the American zone, dressed like a professor and smiling like he hadn't carved living people open just months earlier, he didn't wait for clearance. He dragged Reiniger into an alleyway, shoved a pistol into his gut, and whispered, "Tell me how many screamed before you called it research." The scientist begged, offered names, files, money. Harrow pulled the trigger anyway. That night, his handler showed up with shaking hands and a fresh set of papers. "Do you have any idea who you just killed?" "Yes," Harrow said, lighting a cigarette. "And next time, send someone else if you want the devil kept on a leash." They didn't punish him. They couldn't, because they needed men like him now more than ever. The Cold War had no rules, no clear battle lines, just whispers, betrayals, and knives in the dark. But something was breaking inside Harrow. He began having nightmares, not of the men he'd killed, but of the ones he hadn't. The ones who'd authorized those prison camps. The ones back home who shook hands with monsters and stamped the file's top secret in the name of national security. He saw Admiral Collins's smug face. The men who called him a hero one minute and a liability the next. He saw medals made of lies. One night, deep in occupied Prague, he stood on a rooftop watching a convoy of American officials shake hands with former Nazi collaborators. Deals were being made, scientists traded, war criminals rebranded, and Harrow snapped. "This wasn't why we fought," he growled to the wind. "This wasn't why Mendez bled out in that damn hospital. This war never ended." He vanished after that. The agency labeled him off-grid, internal defect, dangerous, but he wasn't gone. Soon after, military black sites across Europe began getting hit. Storage facilities raided, files stolen, names exposed. War profiteers found dead in their beds, their throats cut, no forced entry. CIA and KGB agents alike started murmuring the same phrase across smoky rooms. The Harrow Protocol. No official existence, no trail, just a name carved in fear. And whenever another butcher in a clean suit tried to vanish behind bureaucracy, they'd check under their cars, watch their backs, sleep with the lights on, because James Harrow had become something more than a soldier. He was now retribution personified. The suicide run hadn't ended at sea. It was still running, burning through history, one guilty soul at a time. The rain fell hard in Geneva that night. Not the soft kind that whispers across cobblestone. This was angry, pounding rain, like the sky was trying to drown something ugly that had crawled up from hell and taken root in the city of diplomacy. Inside a luxury hotel overlooking the lake, men in suits laughed over drinks worth more than a soldier's paycheck. They were all there for a peace conference, one of those sterile political masquerades where war criminals wore silk ties and handshakes killed more people than bombs ever could. James Harrow sat at the bar, dressed like a tired tourist, nursing a scotch he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. His reflection in the mirror looked nothing like the photos in old OSS files. The years had etched war into his face. Lines like battle scars, eyes darker than ever. But his hands were still steady. He wasn't here for peace. He was here for the butcher of Mindoro, General Tsunemori Hayashi, who was now calling himself a strategic advisor for a multinational firm contracted by the U.S. military. Same man, new suit, new name, same blood-soaked legacy. Harrow had followed his trail for 2 years, through shell companies, fake identities, government loopholes. Hayashi had escaped Tokyo trials by switching sides at the last moment, feeding intel to the Allies about Russian movements in exchange for a new life in the West. Now he was giving talks on post-war stability, while the ghosts of his victims still clawed at the soil back in the Philippines. But tonight, those ghosts had a voice. Harrow left the bar quietly, moving through service corridors like he'd built them himself. He bypassed 2 guards, disabled the cameras, and found Hayashi's suite on the 12th floor. Inside, the general was on the phone, laughing in Japanese. He didn't even have time to turn. Harrow pressed the silencer to his temple. "You remember the bay?" Hayashi's eyes widened. "Who?" Harrow pulled the trigger. One shot. No hesitation. The body slumped against the glass, blood smearing across the window as thunder cracked outside. For a moment, Harrow just stood there, watching the lake reflect the flickering lights of a world that had moved on without justice, without memory, until now. The headlines the next day were confused. Prominent defense consultant found dead in Geneva. No suspects, no motive. Authorities baffled. They blamed Russian operatives. Then local crime. Then silence. But in the underground, in the files that never got filed, one phrase kept circling: the suicide-run lives. It became a warning, a myth whispered in war rooms and intelligence bunkers. When men in power made deals with devils, they always asked, "Is Harrow still out there?" And though no one had seen him in years, every now and then, a file would vanish. A war criminal would disappear. A coffin would arrive closed, with no explanation. Some said he'd died long ago. Others swore they'd seen him, an old man with a limp, wearing a cap low over his eyes, always watching. But the truth was carved into a rusted hull at the bottom of Manila Bay, the last remnant of a 50-foot boat that once roared into fire and rewrote history. That boat was gone. But the man who lit the match, he was still burning, and the war, his war, would never truly end, until the last butcher was ash and the ocean was silent again.